Okay, get this. Does your living room disappear when you leave the room? Sounds bonkers, right? But Einstein apparently noodled on whether the moon vanishes when nobody's looking.
Wow. Okay.
And that kind of head-scratcher was the launching pad for some, well, truly revolutionary ideas back in 1993 with Amit Goswami's The Self-Aware Universe. It asked us to rethink, well, pretty much everything.
It really did shake things up.
Hey, if this kind of deep dive into the mind-bending gets your neurons firing, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more rabbit holes like this to explore together.
Yeah, it definitely helps us keep bringing these conversations to you.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we grab a stack of brainy sources. In this case, we're revisiting a classic, Goswami's book, but also digging into some fascinating updates that have been published since then. Consider this an update to a book that was, in many ways, ahead of its time.
Right, trying to synthesize it all.
And we distill them down into the stuff that makes you go, aha! Consider us your guides to the intellectual jungle.
Hopefully making it a bit less dense.
Today, our mission is to give you the ultimate ELI 5 friendly update on the core of Goswami's 93 mind blower. We want to see how more recent thinking builds upon it, or maybe challenges it.
Yeah, see where the ideas stand now.
So prepare for a shift in perspective that could genuinely leave you questioning the very fabric of reality.
It's a big one. What's fascinating here is the big picture we're tackling. This massive shift, really, from a centuries-old idea that the physical world, matter is the fundamental bedrock of everything.
The default setting, basically.
Exactly. Shifting from that to a startling alternative, that consciousness itself might be the primary reality and everything else kind of springs from it.
Whoa, so not reality built on tiny billiard balls of matter.
No, but imagine it built on pure awareness. That's the radical core we're diving into today. And yeah, it flips our usual understanding completely on its head.
Absolutely. So let's set the stage a bit. Back when Goswami first wrote The Self-Aware Universe, the dominant philosophical outlook of classical physics, material realism, remained widely accepted. Many physicists, conditioned by the old worldview, found the idealist implications of quantum mechanics difficult to entertain and preferred not to ask the embarrassing metaphysical questions raised by the theory of quantum mechanics.
Right. Many physicists remained focused on the pragmatic use of quantum mechanics for calculation and prediction, often adhering to interpretations that downplayed metaphysical questions or maintained a material realist stance. But we were starting to see discussion and theoretical explorations across physics, philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, mathematics, and broader consciousness studies. So, back to that whole deterministic picture.
Yeah, think of it like a giant, predictable clockwork mechanism. If you knew the starting positions and speeds of all the gears, you could theoretically predict everything that would ever happen.
Very neat, very tidy.
But also, well, where does our inner life fit into that? Our thoughts, feelings?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this clockwork universe, while it was brilliant for explaining things like, gravity and planetary orbits and how your toaster works.
Useful stuff.
Very useful. But it also created this real split, what Goswami actually called a chasm between science and spirituality, or even just the study of the mind.
Right. Science dealt with the tangible, the measurable stuff.
The objective world out there.
While consciousness, our thoughts and feelings, were sort of pushed aside into this squishy subjective corner that science couldn't quite get a handle on.
Yeah, it was like, we'll deal with that later. Maybe.
And this led directly to the famous mind-body problem. It's a classic. You've got physical stuff, your brain, all neurons and chemicals.
Tangible matter.
And then you've got this seemingly non-physical stuff, your thoughts, feelings, your experience of being you. Descartes basically threw up his hands and said, they're totally separate things. Dualism.
Like two different universes somehow interacting.
Yeah, like trying to mix oil and water, except somehow these two fundamentally different things are supposed to influence each other. How does a non-physical thought actually make your physical finger move? Philosophers have been banging their heads against this wall for centuries.
It's a genuine puzzle if you start from the assumption that matter is primary. How do you get subjective experience out of just physical stuff?
Exactly. How do you explain the subjective experience of consciousness, that feeling of being you, the redness of red within a purely physical world?
Some theories just suggested consciousness was like an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of brain activity, like the exhaust fumes from a car.
Just along for the ride.
Yeah, but not really doing anything significant. But that never really felt right, did it? I mean, our inner lives feel incredibly real and like they actually cause us to do things.
It feels like it matters. And then, like a cosmic plot twist, quantum physics burst onto the scene in the early 20th century, and it threw a major wrench in that neat, tidy clockwork universe.
Oh, absolutely. A huge wrench.
Suddenly, things weren't so predictable down at the micro level. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle said you can't even know everything about a tiny particle, like its exact position and momentum, at the same time.
Limits to knowledge build right into the fabric of reality.
Then wave-particle duality, the idea that light and even matter can act like spread-out waves or localized particles depending on how you measure them.
Which is just bizarre from a classical standpoint. Things are either waves or particles.
Right. And those quantum leaps, electrons just instantly jumping between energy levels without traveling through the space in between. Material reality started looking less like solid, predictable ground and more like, well, something much weirder. Quantum foam, maybe?
Yeah, weird is definitely the word. And what's fascinating is how directly quantum mechanics challenged those old materialist deterministic rules. The idea that events at the smallest level aren't predetermined, but are fundamentally probabilistic, a matter of chance, governed by wave functions.
Right, probabilities, not certainties.
That really shook the old deterministic view to its core. And perhaps even more surprisingly, the observer, us, started to look less like a passive spectator just recording what's happening.
Just watching the clockwork tick.
And more like an active participant, somehow involved in shaping the reality that gets observed.
Exactly. Niels Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation, which became sort of the standard view for a long time, went even further. It basically suggested that we can't even meaningfully talk about a quantum object having definite properties, like a specific position, until we actually measure it.
It's not just that we don't know it, it's that it doesn't have it.
Precisely. The act of measurement isn't just revealing what was already there, hidden from view. It's somehow collapsing the possibilities, bringing one specific reality into being. Talk about a mind-bending promotion for the observer.
It really puts the observer center stage in a way classical physics never did. And this is where the concept of potentia comes in, which Goswami discusses quite a bit.
Okay, potentia. Let's unpack that.
So, the idea is, before we make an observation, a quantum system doesn't exist in one definite state, but rather in a superposition of all its possible states simultaneously. It exists in a realm of possibilities, a state of potential.
Like having many different paths you could take, all somehow existing at once.
Kind of, yeah. It's described by the wave function, which holds all these possibilities. Now, Goswami argues, and this is key for his idealist view, that this realm of potential, this potentia, isn't floating out there in the physical world somewhere waiting to be discovered.
Okay, where is it then?
He argues it exists within consciousness itself. Consciousness is the domain where these possibilities reside before one is actualized through measurement or observation.
Wow, so potential realities live in consciousness. Okay, that feels like a perfect lead-in to part 2 of our deep dive. This idea of conscious realism. Instead of matter being the foundation, what if consciousness is the ultimate reality and all that quantum weirdness is actually a clue pointing us in that direction?
Precisely. Conscious realism, as laid out in Goswami's work and elaborated in sources like Donald Hoffman's paper, Conscious Realism, flips the script. It proposes what's called a non-physicalist monism.
Okay, big words, break it down.
Right. Monism just means there's only one fundamental kind of stuff in the universe, not two, like in Descartes' dualism, mind and matter. Non-physicalist means that one fundamental stuff isn't physical matter or energy.
So it's consciousness.
Exactly. The one fundamental stuff is consciousness. This neatly sidesteps the whole mind-body problem because mind and matter aren't seen as separate things to begin with. They're just different ways consciousness appears or manifests.
So no more head-scratching about how the non-physical ghost in the machine pulls the physical levers. Problem solved.
Well, it reframes the problem fundamentally, yeah. Now that paper we mentioned, Conscious Realism, really dives into why the traditional physicalist attempts to explain consciousness seem to fall short.
Like trying to explain the taste of chocolate using only physics equations?
Pretty much. It looks at various ideas. Representationalism, the idea our minds just represent an external world. Biological naturalism. Consciousness somehow just emerges from complex brain biology. Theories based on neural oscillations or brain waves.
Like consciousness is a particular frequency the brain tunes into.
Sort of, yeah. Or the global workspace theory, where information being shared across different brain regions is consciousness. Even ideas about quantum coherence happening in the brain.
Okay, lots of attempts.
Lots of attempts. But the paper argues they all hit a wall. They can show correlations like, this brain pattern happens when you feel happy, but they don't really explain the subjective experience itself. How does a particular pattern of neurons firing suddenly feel like anything at all? Why does it feel like the vibrant experience of red, or the distinct smell of a rose, or the taste of garlic?
Yeah, that's the hard problem, right? The qualia, that raw personal feel of being alive. A bunch of neurons firing, no matter how complex the pattern, just doesn't seem to capture the sheer feeling of joy or the gut punch of sadness.
Exactly. The what it's like feeliness is missing from the purely physical description. Now here's where it gets really interesting, digging into that paper more. It contrasts something called the hypothesis of friendly formatting, HFF, with the hypothesis of direct realism, HDR.
Okay, HDR sounds intuitive. Direct realism, we just see the world as it is.
That's our everyday assumption, right?
Yeah.
What we see, hear, feel is a direct, accurate reflection of the objective world out there. But think about it, our senses are super limited. We only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. We only hear a certain range of frequencies.
And our brains are constantly filtering, interpreting, filling in the gaps.
Yeah, exactly. So are we really perceiving reality as it is, or are we getting a heavily processed, edited version?
And you mentioned some researchers, Perbs and Lotto, Noe, and Reagan. They have takes on this.
Yeah, they offer these really nuanced perspectives. They argue that perception isn't just about passively recording the present moment like a camera. It's heavily influenced by our past experiences, evolutionary history, and crucially, the purpose of perception.
Which is usually
Survival. Guiding our actions effectively in the world, not necessarily painting a mathematically perfect picture of objective reality. It's about what's useful for us to navigate and interact.
And our interaction matters, how we move, what we pay attention to.
Absolutely. Noe and Reagan, for example, emphasize the role of attention and our sensor motor skills, how we physically engage with the world through our senses. We're not just static receivers. We actively explore and probe. And what we perceive is shaped by that active engagement.
So we're not just cameras pointed at the world. We're more like explorers actively mapping the bits relevant to us.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads directly to the hypothesis of multimodal user interfaces, MUI, as an alternative to just seeing reality directly. This MUI idea is a central pillar of the conscious realism framework presented in that paper.
Okay, MUI, multimodal user interface. That sounds technical, but the user interface part, that reminds me of the computer icon analogy you mentioned before. It's super helpful for wrapping our heads around this. Lay it on us again.
Okay, think about the icons on your computer desktop or your phone screen. You see the little picture representing, say, a document file or a web browser app.
Right, like a little folder icon.
Exactly. Now, is that picture, its shape, its color, its location on your screen, is that actually what the underlying software code or the data stored in the computer's memory is?
No. Definitely not. It's just a symbol.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a user-friendly representation. It's an interface designed specifically to help you, the user, interact with the incredibly complex reality of the software, the hardware, the binary code, the voltages flying around. It deliberately hides all that messy complexity. That's what friendly formatting is all about.
Okay, I see where this is going. So our senses, what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, and our conscious experiences are like those icons.
That's the core idea of the MUI theory. They're useful ways for us as conscious agents to interact with whatever the objective reality truly is, but they are not necessarily direct copies or accurate depictions of that underlying reality.
They're simplified symbols that let us function.
Exactly. The MUI theory proposes that our conscious experiences are a multimodal meaning, involving multiple senses user interface between us, the conscious agent, and the objective world. And crucially, just like your desktop icons don't need to physically resemble the gigabytes of data they represent.
My spreadsheet icon doesn't look like rows and columns of numbers.
Right. Our perceptions don't need to resemble the underlying objective reality they represent. This also helps explain something the paper calls concealed causality.
Concealed causality.
Yeah, think about deleting a file. You drag the icon to the trash can and click empty trash. Poof, it's gone from your view. But you didn't directly manipulate the magnetic bits on the hard drive or the flash memory cells, right? The interface, the icons, the mouse pointer, hides the incredibly complex chain of commands and physical processes that actually leads to the file being marked for deletion or overwritten. The real causal chain is concealed by the user-friendly interface. MUI theory suggests our perception works similarly. The link between our perceived objects and the underlying objective reality is not one of resemblance, and the true causal interactions are hidden.
So when I see a chair, let's use that example, I'm not seeing the real chair, the objective thing in itself, whatever that might be.
According to MUI, no. You're experiencing a chair icon that your consciousness constructs in that moment based on your interaction with, well, something in the objective world.
And the chair you see, if we're both in the room, is your chair icon, and they might not be perfectly identical.
That's the implication. Everyday objects, as we experience them, exist as experiences of conscious observers. There isn't necessarily a single public observer-independent chair floating out there that we both perceive perfectly and identically. We each construct our own chair icon every time we interact with that aspect of objective reality, tailored perhaps slightly differently based on our own sensory systems, history, attention, and needs.
But hold on a minute, this sounds really subjective. If we're just constructing these icons in our consciousness, doesn't that mean reality is just whatever we want it to be? Can't I just decide that chair is actually a giant fluffy rabbit if I really try?
That's a really important point, and the theory addresses it. While we construct these icons, it absolutely doesn't mean they're arbitrary or that anything goes. It's not pure fantasy.
Okay, so what keeps it grounded?
Our interactions with the objective world, whatever its fundamental nature turns out to be, trigger us to construct these icons. And we seem to do so according to certain probabilistic rules and consistent regularities. The objective world, in a sense, pushes back. It constrains the kinds of icons we can successfully create and use.
So reality has rules, even if we don't perceive it directly.
Exactly. That's why the paper describes these icons as being stubborn.
Mm.
You can't just arbitrarily decide the chair is a rabbit, because your interactions with the objective reality that causes you to perceive a chair simply won't support the rabbit icon. If you try to interact with it like a rabbit, you'd quickly find it doesn't behave like one. If you just try to sit on your rabbit icon, you'd likely interact with it in a way that reinforces the chair icon properties, solidity, support, etc. The icons have to be functional guides for interaction.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's an interface, but it's an interface connected to something real that has consistent properties, even if we don't perceive those properties directly. So if the objective world isn't made of unconscious particles and fields, like traditional materialism says, what is it? According to conscious realism, what's behind the interface?
This is the most radical part. According to conscious realism, the objective world, the reality behind our user interface, is itself a world composed of conscious agents interacting with each other.
Wait, so not particles, but other consciousnesses?
Yes. Those particles and fields that physics describes so successfully, those aren't the fundamental building blocks of an unconscious reality. In this view, they are themselves icons within the multimodal user interfaces of conscious agents. They are the way consciousness represents its interactions to itself or to other conscious agents.
So consciousness is primary, and matter and fields are derivative. Symbols that consciousness uses.
Precisely. Matter and fields are high-level summaries, representations constructed by conscious agents for conscious agents. The fundamental reality is purely consciousness, or conscious agents.
Okay, my brain is officially stretching. So the sun isn't this giant ball of incandescent plasma existing independently out there in space. It's an icon. A representation that conscious agents construct when they interact with whatever complex system of other conscious agents constitutes the objective reality we label sun.
That is the logical conclusion of the MUI theory within conscious realism. It's a wildly different picture, isn't it?
Wildly different.
And it suggests that our sun icon, and indeed all our perceptions, are likely what the paper calls quick and dirty guides. They are species-specific adaptations, honed by evolution, that help us navigate our particular niche, survive, and reproduce. They don't necessarily provide a true or complete representation of the objective reality that triggers those icons. They just need to be good enough for us to function.
Like, the icons on your desktop are good enough to manage files, even though they don't show you the binary code.
Exactly that analogy.
Yeah.
Now, the paper also touches on a really interesting objection, a common pushback against this kind of view.
Okay, what's the catch?
The question is, if all of our experience is just a user interface, where is this interface presenting its content? Like, what's the screen? What's the fundamental stuff that these experiences, the redness of red, the feeling of warmth are actually made of? If it's not brain matter, what is it?
Yeah, that seems like a fair question. If it's an interface, it needs a medium, right?
Well, that's a very natural question if you're starting from a physicalist viewpoint, where you automatically assume that an observer-independent physical world of space, time, matter, and energy is the fundamental starting point, the bedrock.
Which is how most of us usually think.
Right. But conscious realism completely flips that assumption. It takes our conscious experiences themselves as being ontologically fundamental.
Okay, ontologically fundamental. Let's break that down again for those of us who don't speak fluent philosophy at breakfast.
Think of it like the absolute foundation of a building, the lowest level you can possibly go. If something is ontologically fundamental, it means it's the most basic level of reality. It doesn't need to be built out of anything else or explained by anything more basic. It just is the foundation.
Like in materialism, physical matter energy is the fundamental stuff. You don't ask what matter is made of in a deeper sense, you just accept it as the starting point.
Exactly. Now, conscious realism proposes that conscious experience itself is that starting point, that ontologically fundamental reality. So the question of what screen are our experiences displayed on, or what stuff are they made of, simply dissolves. It doesn't arise in this framework because the experiences themselves are the fundamental reality. They don't need a separate container or medium or screen to exist on or be made of. They are the stuff.
Gotcha. So the feeling of red is the fundamental reality in that moment, not something painted on some other substance. No cosmic movie screen needed in the sky. Okay, right, part 3. And this brings us back to the quantum realm, which kicked off all this weirdness in the first place, but now we're looking at it through this new lens of conscious realism. How do those famously bizarre quantum phenomena fit into this picture where consciousness is fundamental?
This is where things get really fascinating, and where conscious realism potentially offers some quite compelling explanations for things that are deeply puzzling from a purely materialist perspective. Take the EPR paradox, named after Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, and the subsequent experiments by Elaine Aspect and others.
Ah, yes, spooky action at a distance.
That's Einstein's famous phrase for it. These experiments provided incredibly strong evidence for quantum non-locality. That's the mind-blowing idea that two quantum particles, once they've interacted, can remain linked or entangled in such a way that measuring a property of one particle instantaneously influences the corresponding property of the other particle.
Instantly, even if they're miles or potentially light years apart.
Exactly. Instantly. Faster than light communication would allow, seemingly. This directly challenges the principle of locality, which is a cornerstone of classical physics and our intuitive understanding of cause and effect. Locality says interactions must be mediated by signals traveling through space at a finite speed, no faster than light. Entanglement seems to violate that.
And then John Bell came along with Bell's theorem.
Right, and Bell basically put the nail in the coffin for certain kinds of intuitive explanations. He showed mathematically that any theory trying to explain quantum mechanics using pre-existing hidden variables like secret instructions the particles carried with them from the start would still have to be non-local if it wanted to match the experimental results of quantum mechanics.
So it's like trying to find a secret passage to escape a haunted house, only to discover the passage itself is also haunted by non-locality. There's no escaping the weirdness.
Pretty much. The non-locality seems fundamental. Now, from a conscious realism perspective, how do we interpret quantum collapse, that still mysterious moment when a quantum system existing in a superposition of many possibilities suddenly chooses one definite outcome when we measure it?
Yeah, the measurement problem. What actually causes the collapse?
The idealist interpretation, which aligns perfectly with conscious realism, suggests that consciousness plays a crucial active role in this selection process.
Okay, so when we, as conscious observers, look at an electron or measure its spin, our consciousness isn't just passively recording what was already there.
No, the idea is that consciousness actively participates in resolving the ambiguity, in bringing one of those potentialities held within the wave function into actual definite existence. What about Schrödinger's cat, then? That poor hypothetical creature famously both alive and dead inside a sealed box with a quantum trigger until we open it. How does conscious realism handle that?
Right, the ultimate quantum thought experiment.
From the perspective of conscious realism, the cat, linked to the quantum device, exists in that paradoxical superposition of alive and dead states, but as a potentiality or a set of possibilities residing within the broader field of consciousness. It's the active observation by a conscious observer, opening the box and actually becoming aware of the cat's state that collapses that wave function.
So consciousness forces the universe to make up its mind about the cat.
Essentially, yes. It forces the system to choose a definite state. The cat becomes either definitely alive or definitely dead at the moment of conscious observation. The same logic applies to variations like Wigner's friend paradox,
where one observer inside a lab measures a quantum system and sees a definite outcome, but their friend outside the sealed lab still considers the entire lab system, including the first observer, to be in a superposition until they ask their friend what happened.
Exactly. Until consciousness interacts with the information, the system remains in potentiality. Consciousness, in this view, is the ultimate arbiter of reality at the quantum level. It's what turns quantum possibilities into classical facts.
And what about John von Neumann's famous chain of measurement? This theoretical infinite regress where you have your quantum system, then a measuring device measures it, but the device itself is quantum, so it goes into a superposition. Then another device measures the first device, and so on, ad infinitum.
Right, where does the superposition stop? Von Neumann himself suggested that the chain only terminates, the wave function only collapses, when the information reaches a conscious observer.
So consciousness is the ultimate mic drop, the thing that finally breaks the chain of quantum uncertainty and brings about a definite classical outcome.
That's the interpretation consistent with conscious realism. Goswami introduces this concept of immanent awareness, which is like our individual brain minds, our localized consciousness.
Us, basically.
Us as the local manifestation or access point for a deeper, perhaps universal transcendent consciousness. It's through this immanent awareness, through our conscious experience connected to our brains, that the collapse of the wave function actually occurs. There's never, in this view, a purely physical event devoid of some mental aspect, at least awareness, involved in that crucial transition from potentiality to actuality.
Mind blown. Okay. And what about those more, shall we say, fringe phenomena, things like remote viewing or out-of-body experiences? Could conscious realism offer any kind of framework for understanding those, or are they completely separate?
Well, some proponents of conscious realism, including Goswami in some contexts, suggest that the inherent non-locality of consciousness, which seems strongly hinted at by quantum entanglement, could potentially provide a theoretical basis for these kinds of experiences. The idea is if consciousness isn't strictly confined to the physical brain or body, if it has this non-local aspect, then perhaps awareness can, under certain circumstances, access information or experience perspectives that are beyond the normal limitations of our physical senses.
Like consciousness reaching out.
Potentially. It's suggesting that the connections implied by quantum non-locality might not just apply to subatomic particles, but perhaps to consciousness itself. However, it's really important to stress that this remains a very active and often controversial and speculative area of research and theorizing within the broader conscious realism framework. It's not as established as the core ideas about perception or quantum collapse.
Okay, noted. Fascinating possibility, but still speculative. Right, let's dive into part 4 then, the quantum mind. How does Goswami, and maybe more recent research inspired by these ideas, explore the actual connection between our physical brains and this fundamental consciousness, possibly at the quantum level?
Goswami explicitly proposes that the brain-mind isn't just a classical computer, like a wet biological version of the machine on your desk. He sees it as an interactive system with both classical and quantum aspects, all operating within this broader idealist framework where consciousness is primary.
So quantum weirdness isn't just out there in particle accelerators, it might be happening right inside our heads.
That's the suggestion. He even speculates that those sudden flashes of insight, those aha moments of creativity that seem to come out of absolutely nowhere.
The light bulb moment.
Exactly. He suggests these might actually be examples of quantum jumps occurring within our thought processes. A sudden, discontinuous leap to a new possibility, a new configuration within the realm of mental potentia.
Like your mind suddenly tunneling through a barrier to a new idea instead of plodding along step by step.
It's a good analogy, yeah. A shortcut through the landscape of thought, enabled by quantum processes. He also points to research like Tony Marcel's fascinating work on unconscious perception.
What did Marcel find?
Marcel's experiments demonstrated quite elegantly that even when we're not consciously aware of seeing a word or an image, maybe it was flashed too quickly, our brains still process its meaning at some level, and it can influence our subsequent thoughts or actions.
So stuff happens under the hood before we're aware of it.
Right. And Goswami interprets this as potential evidence for quantum coherent superpositions happening at an unconscious level in the brain-mind. Like multiple interpretations or possibilities are being explored simultaneously in parallel, like a quantum computer exploring multiple paths at once.
Before one specific meaning or perception collapses into our focused conscious awareness.
Precisely. The idea is that consciousness then selects from these unconsciously processed quantum possibilities.
And is there work looking for the actual physical mechanisms, this field of quantum functionalism.
Yes, absolutely. Researchers have been exploring various potential quantum mechanisms within the brain for decades, though it's proven very difficult. The brain is generally considered too warm, wet, and noisy an environment for delicate quantum states like superposition and entanglement to survive for long.
The decoherence problem.
Exactly. But people have proposed possibilities, from quantum tunneling of ions across synapses to more complex theories involving microtubules within neurons or entanglement between electrons and brain molecules. It's still very much an ongoing quest to find concrete evidence for functionally relevant quantum effects in the brain.
But some experiments have hinted at it. You mentioned Grinberg-Zilberbaum.
Yes, Jacobo Grinberg-Zilberbaum conducted some rather famous, though sometimes debated, experiments in Mexico. He claimed to find correlations specifically, transferred potentials in EEG readings between the brain activity of two people who felt a close emotional connection or were meditating together, even when they were in separate electromagnetically shielded rooms.
Like entanglement between brains.
That was his interpretation, suggesting a direct, non-local connection between their consciousnesses, potentially mirroring EPR correlations. It's controversial research, and replication has been difficult, but it certainly offers intriguing food for thought within this quantum mind context.
Okay. So pulling this together, the act of consciousness, choosing the outcome of the quantum state of our brain mind, that's what gives rise to our specific moment-to-moment conscious experience, and maybe also the feeling that we are separate individual beings.
That's the core proposition of the quantum mind model within idealism. The collapse of the quantum possibilities within the brain, selected or actualized by consciousness, is the conscious experience. And the illusion of being a separate self, according to this view, arises from the way our individual consciousness interacts with the fundamental universal consciousness through the specific filter and structure of our individual brain minds.
Like we're individual whirlpools in a larger ocean of consciousness.
That's a common metaphor, yes. This also connects to some complex philosophical ideas about tangled hierarchies and self-reference. Think of Gödel's incompleteness theorems or Escher's drawings, suggesting how our sense of a distinct I, an ego, might emerge from this complex self-referential interplay between different levels of consciousness interacting with the brain. But ultimately, fundamental consciousness itself, in its pure form, transcends this limited sense of individual self or ego.
Which sounds very much like descriptions from mystical traditions.
Indeed, there are strong parallels.
Now, what about Benjamin Libet's famous experiments? The ones that seem to show brain activity related to making a movement before the person reported consciously deciding to move. That caused a huge stir about free will. How does that fit into this quantum mind picture?
Libet's work is fascinating and often misinterpreted. His experiments showed a buildup of brain activity, the readiness potential, starting about half a second before the subject reported the conscious awareness of the intention or urge to flick their wrist.
Which sounds like the brain decided before we did.
That was one interpretation, challenging free will. But Libet himself, and interpretations within the conscious realism framework, suggest something different. It might point to a distinction between a primary, more immediate, perhaps quantum level of awareness, or processing, initiating the action unconsciously.
The initial quantum jump, maybe.
Perhaps. And a secondary level of awareness, which is where our conscious ego self identifies with the action, constructs a narrative around it, and claims conscious intention or authorship. The time lag might simply be the processing time needed for this secondary reflective awareness, the ego story, to catch up with the more fundamental processes that actually got the ball rolling.
So free will might operate differently, maybe in vetoing the urge, as Libet also found was possible?
Exactly. Libet found subjects could consciously veto the urge after they became aware of it, but before the action occurred. So consciousness might not initiate everything, but it retains a power of consent or veto. Goswami also notes that many meditation practices are essentially training to quiet that secondary narrative-spinning ego.
The constant mental chatter.
And to connect more directly with those pure mental states, that primary awareness, which might be closer to the quantum ground of our being before the ego labels and interprets everything. This could involve experiencing different aspects of the ion, intentionality, self-awareness itself, maybe even accessing a sense of free will that's deeper than just choosing between coffee or tea.
And potentially transcending that limited ego sense altogether, which again loops back to spiritual goals.
Precisely.
Okay, wow. We have journeyed through some seriously mind-bending territory. Let's move to part 5. What are the really big picture implications of all this? If conscious realism, maybe involving quantum processes in the mind, is actually a more accurate picture of reality than materialism, how does it change our understanding of, well, basically everything?
I think one of the most profound and potentially healing implications is the possibility of a genuine reconciliation, or at least a bridge, between science and spirituality, or science and the humanities.
Healing that chasm Goswami talked about.
Exactly. If consciousness isn't just an accidental byproduct of dead matter, but is instead the fundamental ground of all reality, then those deep inner experiences explored for millennia by spiritual traditions, things like meditation, peak experiences, states of expanded awareness, feelings of profound interconnectedness, or unconditional love.
Things often dismissed by hard science as purely subjective or illusory.
Right. In this view, they aren't necessarily illusions. They could be genuine encounters with or insights into the deeper nature of reality itself, the very fabric of existence, accessed by turning awareness inward. It gives a potential scientific framework for taking these experiences seriously.
That's huge. And what about ethics? Does a consciousness-centric worldview offer a different foundation for how we should live, how we should treat each other and the planet?
Goswami certainly argues that it does. He explores the potential for what he calls idealist ethics, contrasting it with more traditional approaches like Kantian duty-based ethics or utilitarian greatest good for the greatest number ethics.
How is it different?
Idealist ethics tends to emphasize inner transformation and creativity. The foundation for ethical action isn't just following external rules or calculating consequences, but stems from realizing our interconnectedness at the level of fundamental consciousness. When you deeply recognize that other people are fundamentally aspects of the same consciousness as yourself, harming them becomes harming yourself.
Ah, the golden rule, but grounded in ontology.
In a way, yes. He also connects this to paths of psychospiritual development, mentioning the three major yogas from Hindu tradition: karma yoga, the path of selfless action; bhakti yoga, the path of devotion and love; and jnana yoga, the path of knowledge and wisdom,
As ways to live ethically.
as practical pathways for ethical and spiritual development within this idealist framework. They're all seen as methods for purifying the mind, deepening awareness, transcending the limitations and self-centeredness of the ego, and ultimately realizing the underlying unity of consciousness. The idea is that as we do this inner work, more compassionate, creative, and genuinely ethical behavior naturally arises.
So changing the world starts with changing our own consciousness.
That's a central theme. The importance of practices like meditation and cultivating awareness is highlighted not just for personal well-being, but as crucial tools for accessing these deeper levels of consciousness, understanding our true nature, and acting from that understanding.
So it's not just about having a cool new intellectual theory about the universe. It's potentially about a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves and our place within it, maybe leading to a more meaningful, ethical, and interconnected way of living.
Exactly. That's the ultimate potential here. Goswami talks about a possible re-enchantment of our worldview, moving beyond the often cold, mechanistic, and ultimately alienating view of a purely materialist science opens up the possibility for seeing the universe as inherently meaningful, conscious, intelligent, and deeply interconnected. A universe we are truly part of, not just accidental tourists in.
Wow. Okay, let's try and catch our breath and bring this epic deep dive home. To recap, we've journeyed from the cracks in the old foundation of a purely material universe, explored by classical physics,
A universe that struggled to explain consciousness.
to the radical, mind-bending alternative proposed by conscious realism. The idea that consciousness itself is the fundamental reality.
Flipping the entire script.
We've seen how the enduring mysteries of quantum mechanics, non-locality, the observer effect, the measurement problem provide some really intriguing clues and maybe even supporting evidence for this shift in perspective.
Turning quantum weirdness into potential insights about reality's deep structure.
We explored how conscious realism, especially using the multimodal user interface, MUI theory, offers a new lens to understand perception, seeing our reality as a kind of species-specific dashboard, not a perfect mirror.
Icons, not reality itself.
How it dissolves the traditional mind-body problem and maybe even offers tentative frameworks for understanding consciousness's role in quantum collapse and potentially more unconventional phenomena.
Connecting the micro world of quantum physics to our macro world experience via consciousness.
And we've touched on the quantum mind hypothesis, the ongoing search for quantum processes in the brain, and the profound implications all of this has for our understanding of ourselves, our sense of self, free will, ethics, and our connection to the cosmos. It suggests a universe that is fundamentally alive and aware.
A universe where we are participants, not just spectators.
So remember that initial head-scratcher about the moon? Does it vanish when no one looks? Well, according to the MUI theory within conscious realism, the moon you experience is a phenomenal moon icon constructed by your consciousness when you direct your attention and senses towards, well, whatever objective reality corresponds to the moon.
It exists as your experience.
And someone else looking at the same time. They'd be having their own, perhaps subtly different, moon icon experience constructed by their consciousness. There isn't necessarily a single public, concrete moon existing out there, completely independent of any conscious observer looking at it or interacting with it. The objective reality underlying all those moon experiences is proposed to be a complex system of interacting conscious agents. Mind blown again.
It really forces you to question your basic assumptions about what's real. And as we've explored, these ideas, while definitely challenging our everyday intuitions, maybe understatement of the year there,
Just a bit.
they offer a potentially powerful and arguably more complete framework for understanding existence, one that finally brings consciousness back from the fringes and places it right at the very heart of reality, where, frankly, many people across cultures and history have intuitively felt it belonged all along.
And the updates, the ongoing research like that detailed in the PDF, they continue to explore, refine, and sometimes challenge these core ideas, offering an ever-evolving and truly captivating perspective on the biggest questions we can ask.
The conversation is definitely still evolving.
So as we wrap up, here's a final, truly mind-bending thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If our everyday reality, the world of chairs and trees and stars that we perceive, is fundamentally a user interface, a kind of collective dashboard constructed by and for conscious agents to interact, then what incredible, perhaps literally unimaginable realities might lie beyond that interface?
What's the code behind the icon?
Exactly. What is the true nature of that objective world, which conscious realism suggests is made of interacting consciousness itself? And maybe even more profoundly, what untapped potentials might reside within our own fundamental consciousness, currently hidden behind our everyday user interface self, just waiting to be discovered if we learn how to look past the icons.
It definitely opens things up.
It suggests a universe and a self that is suddenly way more mysterious, vast, and awe-inspiring than we might have thought. And that, my friends, is the deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us down the rabbit hole.